Thanks, Josh. That is a long passage to read in front of a church. And here's the thing about it. That is only half of what Jesus said. We cut it in half. Jesus is going to keep kind of going in this in Matthew 10. We're about kind of halfway through. Tomorrow or next week, we're going to do the rest of it. But I was even thinking as Josh was reading that, I was like, I think we could have cut it even more. I was like, maybe we could have done like 4 sections on this. There's a lot of text to cover. And so we're going to try to blitz through this, hopefully come away with a few things Jesus wants us to see. But real quick, just to catch you up, if you kind of are new to Treeline or you're here for the first time, basically what we do is we just open up the Bible and we just preach what the Bible says. Like not our own ideas, not our own spin, just like what is the Bible teaching us? And so we're in the middle of this study in Matthew. And so just to kind of catch you up so far, what has happened? Jesus has kind of come onto the scene as this kind of like prolific, profound teacher. And that's kind of how it starts. Like Jesus begins by doing all these kind of teachings and people are listening to him, like the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe you've heard of that. And they're basically walking away from Jesus' teaching saying like, who is this? Because he doesn't teach like any of our other religious teachers. This is someone who teaches with authority. And then Jesus begins to do kind of all these miraculous things, frankly. Like he's walking on water, he's calming storms, he's healing people who've been paralyzed their whole life. Like there begins to not just be this like authority to teach and explain kind of spiritual things, but there's this authority to literally tell dead people to rise. People who have never walked before to stand up and walk, people who are blind to see. There's this authority that Jesus has. And what Jesus does now is he begins to take this authority that he has and he gives it to his disciples and he says, I want you to go out into the world and continue my ministry. And so Matthew 10 is this kind of interesting moment in Matthew where like the whole kind of like story arc that we've been going through is about to kind of pick up pace and continue on. And it's not just going to be Jesus, but it's all of a sudden going to be Jesus. And now these men who he calls the disciples, but also the apostles, who are going to be kind of continuing the work of Jesus, not just in this story, but actually after Jesus dies on a cross and raises from the dead, they're going to be the ones that continue the work of Jesus here on earth because they've been given his authority. He says, go in my authority and do these things. And so real quick, this is the message that they are called to go and proclaim, right? It says, you're supposed to proclaim this, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And I want to just like start real quick by just kind of glancing over the list of the disciples. So a lot of you probably, you've heard this before. Maybe you haven't been to church in a while, but like, I don't know that much. I don't know their names, but I know there's 12, right? It's like, that's like a pretty common thing. Jesus had 12 disciples, and we've already kind of met a few of them in the story in Matthew, right? We met Peter and Andrew and James and John, these kind of 2 sets of brothers, but we're kind of here listed a bunch of people we haven't actually met in the story yet, but Matthew kind of wants us to know who are all these people. So there's Philip, there's Bartholomew, there's Thomas, there's Matthew, the tax collector we kind of met a few weeks ago. There's James, the son of Alphaeus, and it's a different James. By the way, there's a bunch of different Jameses. Like if you read the Bible, like you're like, wait, who wrote this? Like Jesus' brother's named James, and there's there's like 6 different Jameses. Anyway, this is the son of Alphaeus, and then there's Thaddeus, and there's Simon the Zealot. So apparently Simon, he's like, not just like Simon, like who becomes Peter, but he's like, no, this is the one who used to be a zealot. Like he was kind of part of this kind of religious sect that was trying to overthrow the Romans. And then there's Judas Iscariot, who were just like kind of the only one that we're told a negative thing, right? Who ends up betraying Jesus. One of the things we need to see, there's a bunch of things we're gonna get into, but just from the beginning, we have to just take notice that the Gospel of Matthew is written as a historical document. So like this list that's happening here, it's just literally a description of what really happened. These were real men with real families who lived in real places that you can go and visit today. Like you can still walk in the exact same places that all this stuff happened. And these 12 men, they weren't like mysterious or unknown people who just kind of showed up with Jesus, or even they're not even kind of these like mythological figures that kind of, as like Christianity began to kind of spread, people made up these kind of powerful men who could do miracles and kind of gave backstories to them. That's not what it was. It was just people who were real and they were identifiable and known to their communities. So it was like James, like which one? The son of Alphaeus. And they're like, oh yeah, we know him. Like he lives down the block. And so you just have to know these men were identifiable, they were known to their communities, and when they met Jesus, their whole lives changed. So when you're evaluating Christianity, and I know some of you in the room, you wouldn't claim to be a Christian, you're trying to figure out, like, what do I do with this message? It isn't just you're trying to figure out, like, if this whole Jesus thing makes me feel good. You're also not just trying to figure out if this is a community that I want to be part of. You see, the gospel writers are wanting you to respond to a historical account of things that happened in their cities and in their actual towns surrounding this real man named Jesus who lived and breathed and did these things. And one of the things that happened was that Jesus took these 12 men who were very ordinary men, like they're fishermen, they're tax collectors, they're just really normal, average people. He pulled them into his inner circle. He gave them authority, and he sent them out into the world as his apostles to continue the work that he started. And these men turned the world upside down. Like if you're here in Ann Arbor, you are part of something that is called Western civilization. And almost exclusively, so much of what we like live and eat and breathe and think about comes from what came out of this conversation in Matthew 10. Like we just have to reckon with it. These men, normal 12 men, turned the world upside down. Why? What was it about this crew, right? And we're actually told in no uncertain terms it didn't have anything to do with who they were, because before they met Jesus, they were kind of just normal nobodies. The thing that made them different was that he called them to follow him, and he gave them authority. Now look at what he kind of says here in verse 5, because he gives them authority for a very specific purpose, okay? So these 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, saying, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and proclaim as you go, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and I want you to heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, and cast out demons. So listen, isn't it Jesus just kind of gave them these incredible abilities to kind of go and do whatever you want, right? When God gives you authority, he gives it to you for a very specific purpose, and the authority that Jesus gives to them, at least in this part of the story, is to bring a message and to do miracles for a very specific group of people, and they're called the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And it's actually interesting. In this section, Jesus actually says, hey, don't go to the Gentiles, which is interesting because like most of us are Gentiles, right? Like he says, don't go to them. I just don't go to the Samaritans. Just go to Israel. And this is kind of weird, I think. If you've been following along in Matthew, or if you know much about Jesus at all, this should kind of strike you as a weird thing, because one of the things that we probably love about Jesus is that he does not follow the normal kind of social or tribal kind of like boundary lines, right? He's always kind of stepping over whatever culture said, hey, we don't associate with those people, we don't hang out with them, or like we are God's chosen ones, they are not. Jesus is always kind of stepping out of that boundary line to love people unconditionally. And even at the very end of Matthew 28, he's gonna gather these same group of people, and he's gonna give them a pretty similar command, but instead of saying go to the Jewish people, he's gonna say go make disciples of all nations. So why here, at kind of the beginning of everything in Matthew 10, does he say, don't go to everyone, just go to Israel? It's kind of interesting. And frankly, it's a little bit weird. Well, here's why. Jesus is not just coming into like a blank page in history. He's coming into a very specific story, and into the story that God has been writing and the people of Israel for thousands of years. You see, Israel is it's a specific group of people that had been given promises and prophecies of how God was going to one day heal everything that is broken and messed up in the world. And so Israel's like everybody in the sense that they can look around the world and they go, this place is pretty messed up. Like we can't figure out how to fix it. Like no matter who's been king, no matter what political system we've come up with, like everything seems to still be broken. And so they saw the same things we saw, but into their story, God gave them this hope and these promises saying, through you, I'm going to one day raise up a kingdom that will change everything. And so that's what it was to be part of the people of Israel, is to not just be in the world and see the world's broken, but it was also to be the people who kind of were like the gatekeepers of these promises, this revelation from the prophets saying one day there's going to be a king who will come who will set everything right once again. And the prophecies were really specific. Like they're told that there's going to be this Messiah who's going to be this anointed one. He would be the one that God would use to actually bring about his kingdom. And we're actually told so many things in the Old Testament. We're told about his bloodline, like what his lineage would be. We're told where he will be born, what he will be like. We're told what will happen to him. There are hundreds and hundreds of kind of prophetic like images and pictures that we are given of what one day this king will be like. And so why start with Israel? Well, because their whole history and story has been pointing forward to this day. They had the book, they had the promises, and they were the ones who were supposed to be living their lives waiting for this Messiah to come, and when he came, to join with him. And so Jesus chooses and sends out 12 disciples because they're meant to be witnesses to the 12 tribes of Israel. And so have you ever wondered, like, why 12? Like, that's part of the reason why. Because these 12 men were meant to be witnesses to all of Israel about their king has come. That's at least half of why, but it's also more than that, because Jesus says that not just are the ones that have the prophecies and the promises, but he calls them the lost sheep of Israel. So it's not just that they have this kind of history, but actually currently Jesus says they're lost. Like they're not actually waiting for the Messiah to come in that way. They're not actually kind of like on the edge of their seat, like waiting. They're kind of lost spiritually. And so what Jesus is doing in this moment of kind of gathering 12 and sending them out is he is basically taking all the promises that God has given to the people of Israel. He's wrapping them around himself, and symbolically he is like restarting the people of God through himself. You see, Jacob, who would be named Israel, which is where we get the name Israel, he would have 12 sons that all of God's people would trace their lineage back to. But now Jesus would have 12 apostles that all of God's people would trace their lineage to. And it's not a lineage of bloodline, but it'd be a lineage of faith in the message of Jesus as preached by these 12 men who were sent out on the authority of Christ to preach the gospel. And so the first thing that Jesus does is he goes, hey, this is going to expand over the whole world, but first we need to start here. And so he actually sends these men to the towns and the cities that were surrounding the places where like his biggest miracles had been done. Just like is like a really local mission. And here's the message, okay? Verse 7, he says this: as you go into these places, proclaim, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, and cast out demons. Now, the message that Jesus sends his disciples with is essentially this: a new kingdom is coming, the revolution has begun. That's it. That's like the essence of this message. A new king is here, a new kingdom is coming, and the revolution has begun. Do you want to join? That's the message. And one of the things that Matthew's trying to do in this section is he's trying to help us understand something that's really important, and it's this: Jesus is not a wallflower. He isn't a pushover. He isn't someone to be taken lightly. Often when we think about Jesus, we think of him as like a friend of sinners, someone who is relatable and knowable, someone who is gentle and lowly, and all of those things are absolutely true. But Matthew starts his story of Jesus way back in Matthew 1 with a genealogy. You remember that? You're like, weird way to start a book, makes me not want to keep reading it. It starts with like, and then this, and then this. Why does he start that way? Because he is tracing the bloodline, because he's telling you the story of the one who's going to be the king. So he's saying Jesus is a king, and he's bringing about a kingdom. And in this passage, we are told that this kingdom will not just divide households, but it will divide the world. And so Jesus sends out his 12 apostles, and he gives them the authority to cast out demons and raise dead people to life. It's an interesting thing to go along with this message about a kingdom, right? And the reason he does this, the reason he gives them this authority, is because as he sends out his apostles with this message, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he's sending them into the world with a declaration of war. That's what this is. Jesus is sending them out with a declaration of war, saying there is a new king, there is a new kingdom that's coming, and I am actually in this moment not just proclaiming that, but I'm actually even giving you the authority to wage war on all the powers and authority that currently has sway in this place. So he goes, everything that's sick and broken and dead and dying, heal it. If someone's dead, raise them to life. If someone has a power of darkness, a demon, cast it out. Because the kingdom of God is coming, because the king has come. You see, this is the picture that Matthew is trying to paint for us. He really wants you to understand Jesus is not just a good kingdom, not just a good teacher. He wants you to view Jesus through this picture of like a king coming to set up his authority here on earth. And this is literally the last 6 chapters, right? He keeps saying this, like he's teaching with authority. It's authority, 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 right? He has the authority to teach. He has the authority to heal. He has the authority to command nature. He has the authority to cast out demons. He has the authority to forgive sins. And then right before this, kind of one of the last powerful moments is you have these 2 blind men who see Jesus more clearly than anyone else, and they say, "You are the son of David," right? He's saying, like, you are this king that's been prophesied in the line of King David that's going to come and actually bring about this kingdom of heaven that will change everything. And this is what Matthew's trying to do, is he's trying to help you understand who Jesus is in like the biggest picture kind of way. Matthew does not portray Jesus as just a spiritual man who's starting a new religion. He presents him as one with authority who starts a revolution. That's who Matthew thinks Jesus is, as one who spent the most time with him. And he wants to give you the whole picture of Christ. He's like, I want you to know Jesus is the friend of sinners. I want you to feel that. Like, I mean, a couple chapters ago, like, I want you to know this is what Jesus is like. But if you're gonna understand Jesus, you have to understand he is a revolutionary who's bringing about not a small change, but he's literally bringing about a new kingdom to earth. And so go out and proclaim to people the kingdom of heaven is at hand. There is a new authority that is here. His name is Jesus. So that's the message, all right? And honestly, we could spend a whole 25 more minutes just talking about that, but we got to move on because we got 25 verses, okay? So that's the message, but he gives some instructions, okay? Look at verse 9. He says this. He says, okay, here's how you're supposed to do this. Acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, nor 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for the labor deserves his food. Really kind of confusing, okay? Like, I don't know if you felt this, but I spent like all week digging through so many different commentaries trying to figure out what this means and how to apply it to our lives. And frankly, I'm not entirely sure how to apply it, okay? But anyway, basically this, he's saying like, hey, here's what I want you to do. Don't prepare a bunch for this journey. Don't gather all this stuff. Don't get money, like all these kinds of things. This is urgent. You just need to go and proclaim this like now. Like you don't have time to prepare for this thing. You just need to get the word out. And so one of the things we're supposed to see here is like Jesus is trying to give, like there's an urgency here, right? But the other thing that's interesting, right? He says, don't go and like collect money for this, right? Like don't go and like you got this message for free. So don't go and be like, hey, if you pay me money, then I'll give you these spiritual blessings, right? So he's like, that's not how this was gonna go. But he goes also, don't bring your own money. Like you're gonna find some people who are gonna be these people who are worthy of the message and they will feed you. So you don't need to prepare for this. I'm gonna provide for you when you're out on this message with me. So that's verse 9. Look what he says in verse 11. He says, here's like what is gonna happen when you bring this message. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake the dust off from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town. So Jesus is sending out his apostles, his disciples, to proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And the thing that we see is immediately he's saying, here's what's gonna happen. When you proclaim this message, it is going to bring peace to some households, some people, and it is gonna bring judgment on others. And he literally says it's gonna divide cities, it's gonna divide households between those who are worthy and those who are not. And this would cause us a question, right? Like, what does it mean to be worthy of the kingdom? Because he's like, it's gonna divide people. There's gonna be people who are worthy of what I'm doing, what I'm gonna bring about. As I become king, they're worthy of me. And there's gonna be people who are not worthy of me. And he doesn't like This is very black and white for him, right? He's not like kind of having this bunch of shades of gray. He's like, no, there are those who are worthy and those who are not. And what's interesting in this passage is those who are worthy are not those kind of marked out by how well they followed the 10 Commandments, right? Because everybody, all the places they're going to, they had the Old Testament, they had the laws. And it doesn't say whoever did a good enough job following them, those are the ones who are worthy. It's not how holy they are. Those who are worthy are those who receive the message of this kingdom and bow their knee to this king. And those who are not worthy are those who do not. You see, based on this people's acceptance or rejection of this message, so they're supposed to either bring peace to the house, kind of stay there and allow their healing, their message to kind of be on this place, or it says they're supposed to shake the dust off their feet and leave. How many of you have done that? I've never done that. Like, this is like culturally far from us, right? You're like, I have dusty feet. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this. This is like a really actually powerful symbol that you would do. It's like, if you're trying to communicate something and using words is not going to do it, it's like they literally like kick off the dust from that place as they go on their way. And basically what it was is it was saying, hey, we have been faithful as messengers to do our job. Like, it was required of us that we told you this message, and we've been faithful to that, but we are no longer responsible to what happens to you if you reject this. And it seems like you are rejecting this. And so we kind of are like wiping our hands of whatever happens to you. We've been faithful to give you this, but if you reject it, your blood's on your head. We're gonna go give the message to other people about this king who's coming. I mean, literally, it'd be like if there is an actual king coming into a land who is coming to take authority, and you were saying, do you want to be with this king or not? And they're saying, we don't. And it's like, okay, but when he comes, it might go bad for you. Like, that's literally what is happening here. And the reason they're supposed to do that, because as much as the message of the kingdom is bringing peace into the lives of those who receive it, it is actually bringing judgment to those who reject it. Again, this is a revolution. There are those who are with the king and those who are not. Everything in this entire passage plays out exactly like what would happen if a king was going to ascend a throne. And so in verse 15, he says this, truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town that rejects your message. We need to talk about this for a minute, because we're bumping up into something that, frankly, most churches don't want to talk about, judgment, but it's right here. He says there's a day of judgment, and he actually says these towns that reject me as the king and my kingdom is coming, he says it will be worse for them on the day of judgment than even for Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's talk about this, okay? When the Bible speaks about judgment, the Bible is actually very clear about this. It says it over and over and over and over again. It speaks about a day when God, who is the creator of all, will call all of his creation to give an account of the lives they lived. I mean, the whole Bible is pointing forward to this day in one way or another. And listen, if there's no creator and there is no authority over our lives, then we really are free to live how we want. We're free to set up our societies how we want. We're free to live the lives we want to live. But if there is a creator, then our lives are accountable to him. You can't escape that. If God is real, and we are his creatures, he is the judge and the authority over our lives. And the Bible says that not only is there a creator, but there's actually a day where we, as his creatures made in his image, will actually give an account to him. And when the Bible speaks about judgment, it speaks on two levels. The first is there's this kind of broad judgment that comes to all people. And the judgment is basically justice for sin that will either be paid by the individual or it will be paid by Christ on behalf of the sinner. And the picture the Bible gives us is pretty clear. It just says like either Christ will stand next to you in that moment and declare that justice has already been done on your behalf, because in your case, judgment came to him instead of you, and he now bears the marks of judgment on his body on your behalf. Or Christ does not stand next to you. And if you are not in Christ, then you will have to face judgment for your own life on your own. But listen, and that's like a very real thing. Like if you're here and this is the first time you're hearing this, you just need to understand the entire Bible says this. You will not stand before God someday based off of whether you think you have done a good job. You will stand before God someday based off of whether he thinks you have done a good job. But judgment isn't just distributed equally to everyone. Some people think that. And actually, if you think that, the world becomes a very unjust place very quickly. So that's not actually what happens. The judgment of God is justice being enacted. And so actually this passage helps us learn that actually when Hitler faces judgment, he will face a more severe judgment than somebody else who just didn't have the courage or the backbone to stand up to him, right? It's like both of these people brought evil into the world, but there is a different level of judgment. One will be judged more severely, but justice will be done for both. And in this passage, we learn that judgment not only has to do with the life that you lived, but primarily we're told it has to do with how you respond to Christ. These cities where the apostles come, these are cities who largely have been like trying to follow the Old Testament, okay? So these are like religious communities. These are not like these like incredibly godless places that whatever you think of when you think of like just like truly godless city, that's not these cities. But Jesus says that these cities who reject his kingdom, say no to his message, he says it will be worse for them than for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, which were cities in the Old Testament that were so wicked and evil that God literally rained down fire from heaven to destroy them. Now listen, some people, they say this, and I've thought this myself. I've heard people say this. Some people say things like this. They say, I just wish that God would do these kind of miracles in my city today, and then I would believe. Like if Jesus would just today, like start this amazing thing where we could record it with our iPhones and we could just be like, look, this person was dead and now they're alive. Look, this is happening. We tend to think this, and even as Christians, we think this, like if God would just do some of these crazy, miraculous things today in my neighborhood, then these people would actually put their faith in Jesus. But listen, most of the people in these towns rejected Jesus. Like this wasn't actually just a mission to bring peace. Actually, them going and doing miracles in these cities actually brought further judgment on them when they rejected Jesus. People would try to get next to the apostle Peter because if his shadow covered you, you would be healed. That level of miraculous authority is what's happening, and they still didn't bow their knee to the one whose authority Peter went forth through. So listen. Some of the things we think we want Jesus to do in our cities and some of the things we're confused, like why don't you do that? Like why don't you just demonstrate in such a clear, obvious, over-the-top way that you are who you say you are? I wonder sometimes if we don't actually want the thing we want. What if that wouldn't actually make people come to Jesus, but what if the only thing it would do is increase the judgment they face if they still rejected him? And so Jesus says, hey, I don't want you to, this level of authority where you're just raising dead people to life, I don't want you to go everywhere with this. I want this to be for very specific cities that are close to me because I'm trying to do something specific. At the beginning of the church, it does start with profound miracles, but those same miracles, they brought greater judgment on those who saw them and still would not bow their knee. So Jesus is starting a revolution. He sends out his messengers and he's proclaiming there's this new kingdom coming, but he's saying, hey, just like any revolution, this is going to divide people. There are going to be people who are with me and people who are against me. And because of this is kind of where he ends. He says, those who bring this message out into the world, you're bringing a message of revolution. You're telling the authorities that be that there is a new king that I am loyal to. I am not loyal to this place. And he says, if that's who you are, if you're like going out with this message, he says, you should not expect it to go well for you. It kind of ends with this warning. And Matthew 10 is interesting. It's existing on kind of two planes, right? One is he's talking to this group of apostles who are going out in this very specific local mission, doing this specific thing, but he's also kind of at times pulling back and giving sort of like bigger picture instruction of what it's going to look like to just follow Jesus, period, as anybody who's kind of joined into his mission. And so 16 on through the end, it's basically kind of mixing those two things. Some of it is like for them, and some of it is for us. And so this is kind of what he says. He says, behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in the synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. And when they deliver you over, he says, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. And then you kind of go to the end at 23, it just says, they will persecute you in one town, so flee to the next. For truly I tell you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. He's giving them specific instructions, right, on this local mission. But he pulls back and he's kind of just broadly speaking about what it's going to look like to follow Christ. And there's a lot we could say about this, but not everything applies to us, right? Like there's some things in this passage that are just for the apostles. And I am not an apostle and you are not either, right? So there's just some things that are like for these men uniquely. But I think there's some things we can pull from this, right? When Jesus invites people to follow him, he sends them out on a mission. Like this is one of the cool things is Jesus has this authority and he's gonna give this authority to these men, but he's also just gonna give it to the church. Like the church generally, us today, like we are in Ann Arbor and we are still like following up with the authority that God gave these men. And we're still like in some sense holding that authority up for the world and saying, come be healed by our King. Like when you follow Jesus, he invites you to actually take part in his authority and mission in the world. And when you follow Jesus, he gives you his message and he actually invites you to share in his suffering, right? And the reason he invites you to do all of this is because the thing he's inviting you to do is to become somebody who's loyal to a future kingdom. One that's coming but isn't here in fullness yet. And he's saying, listen, if you are loyal to this kingdom, that's mine, this is the kingdom of heaven, that's not here yet, you can be sure that you're going to be persecuted by those who are in charge now. I've been thinking about this week. And I've been trying to think of like, how do you apply this? And there's some sense in which it's just like, hey, we're halfway through this. We're going to like cut and then come back next week to hear the rest of what Jesus kind of gives to his disciples. But I've just been thinking about this. And I think in a fresh way, Jesus is like helping remind me who he is, right? Because we've been learning like he is a friend of sinners. He is warm, he is gentle, he is approachable. And yet Matthew now is like, and I also want you to know he came to start a revolution. And he is a king who has a kingdom. And actually the thing that he is requiring of people is actually that they would come underneath his authority as the king. And so one of the questions I think we need to ask is, are we the kind of people who are receiving that kingdom? Because it's a very different thing, I think, to kind of just intellectually say like, hey, Jesus is great. Man, what a warm, inviting dude. I like that guy. Very different than to say, this is a king who's bringing a revolution and I will be loyal to him, not the powers that are currently here. That's a very, very different way to live. And actually one of those ways to live, right? It won't cost you very much. One of those ways to live will not change your identity in society very much. It won't change your relationships very much, but one really will. And if you're the kind of person that looks at the kingdom of Christ and you say like, that is my king, those are my values, that is my kingdom, I am with him, it actually will begin to change every single thing in your life. Because it's a total different kingdom. And the rules are not the same as the rules here. The things that are valuable to Christ are not the things that are valuable to our world. And so one of the things I've just been processing, and I think even just we just kind of hit pause today and we come back next week and finish this, one of the things I think we need to ask ourselves is, if Jesus is a king, and this whole thing is about a kingdom, how much of our lives are really coming underneath him? Like how much of us are really coming to him as like loyal subjects and actually coming to his kingdom and saying, yes, Jesus, give me those values. Like, are we people who are joining this revolution, or are we still people who are kind of holding him at an arm's distance, or even saying like, I'll let you be my friend. I'll let you be my savior, but I don't know if I want to get off the throne. Jesus did not come to let us sit on the throne. He came to sit on the throne himself. And if we're going to receive him truly and honestly, we have to let him eventually take that place there. Let's pray.